Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives.
Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of Nature Solutionaries. Today, I'm talking to Nadine Goodman, the co-founder of Center for the Adolescents of San Miguel de Allende, a Mexican nonprofit which is dedicated to the advancement of reproductive justice, elimination of violence, racism, and social inequalities. Since its foundation in 1981, CASA and its huge team of volunteers have been improving the living conditions of the most vulnerable population of the Guanajuato state in central Mexico. They run a maternity hospital, a midwifery school, a free daycare center for families in need, and a public library. They also provide free family planning and sexual health education, free legal advice for victims of violence, counseling services, a shelter for battered women, and a 24/7 hotline. Every year, they serve around 80,000 people throughout the country. Over the last 40 years, Nadine held different roles in the organization and mentored hundreds of people. In 2021, she stepped down from the role of the executive director and retired. Nonetheless, she remains active in the fight for reproductive and human rights. Nadine, it's great to have you. Welcome to Nature Solutionaries.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Nadine, you were born in Brooklyn, New York, and obtained 2 master's degrees in social work and public health from Columbia University. What made you settle down in San Miguel de Allende and co-found the Center for the Adolescents of San Miguel de Allende?
Basically, everything has been an organic process. I didn't plan any of this. And so a friend of mine was coming to San Miguel, and she asked me if I would drive from New York with her to Mexico. And I said, sure. And my intention was to stay here a couple months, learn some Spanish, and return to either New York or California. But I never returned. I just stayed here in Mexico.
Wow. It's been quite a number of years, right? Since you've stayed.
You never know what's going to happen. I mean, basically, I fell in love with the town. The need was glaring, especially the overwhelming numbers of young girls, adolescents who were pregnant and who were lacking in access to good information in a non-judgmental way, never mind family planning, which had, reproductive justice has always been very important to me. And then later on, I also met Alejandro, who's the co-founder of CASA, and years later we got married and so on and so forth. Life just unfolded, and that's what happened.
So you stayed there, you were learning Spanish, and then you found a job?
I said to my husband, who at the time was not my husband, okay, I'll consider staying here, but I need to have financial independence and find work. And then I did do a lot of other things simultaneously as we were founding CASA. I worked with the Mexican Public Health Department for the state and precisely doing a family planning program. And I taught English classes, and I worked as a clinical social work therapist. And I did, a million things, which I've done, frankly, most of my working life to support myself and our family.
All right. And in 1981, you founded CASA. And since then, you've always worked for this organization, right?
Yes, I have.
All right. So what were the needs that people had back then? And have the needs changed over time?
That's another good question. I think the needs are really profound and the same. It's just the window dressing is different. And the needs, really, I speak about understanding what it means to have corporal autonomy, to be able to enjoy our sexuality and sensuality, separate it from reproduction, have control of our fertility, be able to, people who identify as women as well as others, control our destiny that way. And I think that while there is more and more exposure to both information as well as to contraceptives, as well as to abortion services, as well as to self-determination for birth, we just still have a long way to go worldwide.
And what challenges do women and young girls in Mexico face with regards to the use of modern contraception?
Literally since the 60s, there's been increasing access to contraceptives. There's, even a national program for free contraceptives. But as we know, especially when it comes to sexuality and reproductive health, access is a tricky concept because, one thing is having on the books that there's free contraceptives. The other thing is that the free contraceptives are literally in the healthcare facility. The other issue is, especially with young people, do they want to go to that government facility? We talk about adolescent-friendly facilities. Sometimes they're friendly. Most of the time, they're not that friendly. So on one level, as compared to my country of origin, contraceptives are even more available here. But on the other level, some of the social mores and attitudes are such that people are reluctant to access the services. Sometimes healthcare providers are less than amenable, especially when young people go looking for services. They're judgmental. They make comments. They don't make it friendly. Sometimes distribution problems occur. So that means that the different contraceptives are really not available to everyone, and so on and so forth. I think, if you look at the data, whether it's, I don't know, I'll use the United States again, a first world country such as the United States, still half the pregnancies are unintentional. And that also occurs in many other countries, including in Mexico. The data is about the same, meaning that never mind adolescents, but of all ages, half the pregnancies are not intended.
Exactly, yes.
That speaks to our ambivalence, to put it mildly, about all of this. It's not just access to contraceptives or even access to abortion services. It's about why we feel comfortable or not comfortable with our sexuality and our sensuality, and how we separate that out from how many children we want to have or don't have.
So many people think that it's just about access, just about, having contraception or condoms everywhere. But it's so not true. It's also a lot about social and cultural, religious norms. Like, you can have contraception anywhere, but if religious leaders are telling you must not use it, then it's for nothing,
Obviously, the birth control pill in the 50s made a big difference, for sure, in terms of liberating, in particular, people who identified then as women. But I think that we're still very repressed and very reluctant to share information and feelings. There's still an incredible amount of shame, embarrassment. We don't really help each other that much with information when we don't share. And I mean, sharing our experiences, whether it's how does this contraceptive work or not, that's sort of the most easiest or pedantic of all of these things, to share about what it means to feel intimate, to what it means to feel, the release of an orgasm and the happiness that is affiliated with that, whether it's sharing, what it means to go through menopause. We say that we share those things, but we really don't. As I've gotten older, I've had more and more women say things like, I wish somebody had told me how my vagina is going to get more and more dry, and intercourse is going to be more and more painful. And what are possible ways of being able to be intimate without having that pain? I mean, there's just so many things that we don't talk about that aren't included in, quote, educational programs, or, people, how active they are sexually. There's still a reluctance to share, that data as if it means that you're a good person or a bad person, or satisfied or unsatisfied. There's so much that we still don't talk about. I mean, even postpartum depression is just barely beginning to be talked about. Mothers having moments of utter despair with young children, and vice versa.
Exactly. Yeah, I can totally identify with that.
Exactly. I mean, these are the things that, we're just still bound up with feelings of embarrassment, never mind, shame about all of these things, as if we were the only one. I mean, that there's nobody in a situation where you are the only one. But if you don't hear somebody else saying, that happened to me too, that's happening to me too, we can't really move forward in any constructive way. So I think, talking about things is really important. And then obviously having concrete services and contraceptives in terms of the whole range of contraceptives. We know that, the more and more options we have, the more likely it is people will make decisions. We need more money invested in research. I mean, it's kind of the simultaneous coexistence of two seemingly contradictory realities. Is we've come so far, and we are moving so fast in a positive direction, but that doesn't mean that there's so many, deep roots that are still like stuck in the ground that we have to continue to pull up to be able to make real progress.
You're so right that there is this huge vacuum about all these topics that you mentioned. And even though sex and sexuality is so common and everyone does it, people don't talk about it. And that's why people then feel very lonely, or they don't share things. And as you said, they think that only they're dealing with the problem. But I don't know who should be opening up the discussion, like whether just friends among friends, or I don't know whether in families people talk about these issues, or journalists, or who should be doing this in your view?
All of us. I mean, that's the only way that you get an attitude change that's going to permeate all levels of society. I mean, I can tell you years ago when I was doing sex education every day kind of thing out in the field, I would often be, for example, in front of a group of teachers, and the supposed purpose of our, workshop was to help the teachers who were obliged by the law within the school systems to be giving sex education. But, I always say we don't miss what we don't know. And of course, if nobody had given them sex education, how were they going to give it to somebody else without, any training? It's not something you just know because you are born with X biology. Even if you become a teacher, it's very, it's not included in your training. But what I would find when I would give these workshops is we would barely touch the subject of how to teach adolescents, because we would start with, okay, what do you want to know? And we would start with, very simple, like, here's a shoebox and here's a little piece of paper, and put your anonymous questions, on your little piece of paper, and we'll answer all the questions, out loud. So the teachers would be saying things like, how come I never really feel satisfied when I have sex? And what does satisfaction mean? And what is an orgasm? And how do you learn how to do oral sex? And why is that important? Or is it dirty? Or, am I going to get a disease? Blah, blah, blah. But I mean, these were important, really great questions that they needed to know to help themselves before you could, really require them or request of them to help their students. And But I think establishing that atmosphere that all questions are valid, nobody's going to laugh at anybody else. We all have similar doubts, but are afraid to voice them, is the foundation that they needed to then work with their students.
And I think that the students would be then asking pretty similar questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is it doesn't really matter what a fabulous or not education you've gotten. We all probably in the end learn better. I mean, education in terms of academics. I think we all learn best through experience. So if you yourself have not experienced satisfactory sexual relations, it's hard to promote healthy sexuality if you yourself are not experiencing that.
There are these big cultural and religious pressures on people to not talk about these things. Do you think that there is a way to break that or to have an open conversation when, for example, religions are not comfortable talking about these issues?
I think a lot of people in the churches, the different churches, hierarchies are changing and speaking, if not openly, privately to people who go to their churches about these are your personal decisions and so on and so forth. I don't know. I think that whether the subject is sexuality, contraceptives, or whatever, my tendency is to feel that a lot of times we say that, oh, this is a religious war. It really doesn't have that much to do with religion.
So what does it have to do with then?
I think controlling women's fertility has been something that still many people want to do, I guess, because we're talking about the number of human beings who then can be utilized in the labor markets, never mind to form our armies. But the point is, nobody has the right to make any decisions about anybody else's body. That's an individual decision. And while there are some people who, for religious convictions, for example, feel that abortion is immoral, I don't want to say I don't think that's their sincere position, but where do you draw the line? I mean, so then when a man masturbates, are those sperm, are you doing something wrong? If you have an abortion, is conception the beginning of life? When is a fetus viable? I mean, those really are not the issues, in my opinion. The issue is that each of us has to make our own decisions, and we're not harming someone else. But I think those are, it's really we've have all of this stuff sort of all mixed up, still convoluted, and we're not really talking about the way we treat each other and how we are abusing of our power when we have more power than somebody else, and how until we have a world where there's more parity in terms of dignified existence for all, we're all part of the abuse of power, whether we pretend to be excluded from that and supposedly not harming anyone. I mean, it's hard because we all feel that there's nothing we can do, but there's always something we can do.
But are you talking about abusive power of patriarchy or about what type of power?
I think that if you think that you should be able to have control of somebody else's bodily autonomy, that's abusive, that you're abusing power. And I think that there are many other, our economic systems globally are abusive. We're not entering into relationships where it's really win, win, win. It's usually, trickle down, and we're abusing of our advantages, those who have it. I mean, my point is that whether it's political, reproductive, economic, it's all intertwined, and that we have to look at that. I mean, that's what the concept of reproductive justice is. It's not just rights and access. It's, as you say, the elements that are, it's not so easy to understand, which are attitudes or feelings of safety. I mean, it's not just, are you going to have a child or not going to have a child? It's how you want to have that child. And then does that child, do we as a global society protect that child? And are all children brought up in safe environments? Obviously not. And, the extreme is when they die prematurely and or killed in conflict. But, probably 99% of mothers these days would say, I don't feel that my child is safe. I feel like I have to literally be on top of my child for him or her to supposedly be safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously an indicator that we're not doing so well.
So the way out, or one of the ways out, as I get it from what you're saying, is to be more open to talking about the various issues that people face.
Yes, talking about things is very important, but obviously you don't just stop at talking. We have to have action, and we have to have more parity, not just in terms of access to contraceptives and healthy sex education and abortion services, but also to dignified means of finding out who we are, finding work that is satisfactory, having, a roof over our heads and good food to eat, and environments in our communities that help us raise healthy families. Being a feminist is not just, you can, I always say, if you don't have contraceptives and abortion, you kind of like that game Monopoly, you can't pass go, never mind collect $200. It's the beginning of being able to find out who you are, especially if you identify as a woman. But, the concepts are much broader. And I think that's what we're seeing worldwide is we can have civil rights movements, we can change laws, but if we still have many other manifestations, even underground, most of them of racism and of classism, we still have a lot of work to be done. There are still very severe problems.
I noticed that CASA has this holistic approach, and I'm fascinated with it. You run a maternity hospital and a midwifery school, daycare, a library, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you promote reproductive health and environmental well-being. You run a radio program and a violence prevention program. It's incredible. Did you always have this broad vision, or did you keep on adding new services?
Both, at the risk of sounding really obnoxious. I mean, I've always felt like you have to connect the dots. But what has happened over the 40x years of the life of this nonprofit, it's been a very organic thing. I mean, we started in the early 1980s with sex education and family planning. And then, through the grapevine, traditional midwives came to us. So we started to learn more about midwifery. Simultaneously, those of us that started working when we were in our teens or in our 20s, obviously we became also we were in our reproductive age, and we started to make decisions about having kids. So not only were we thinking about what kind of pregnancies and births did we want, but we were thinking about, we have to keep working to make a living. And if we don't have our children safe, whether, we're talking about our infants or our preschool age kids, we're not going to be good workers. So we started to have the on-site daycare. When the traditional midwives said, this is a story of midwifery in Mexico and worldwide, it's a dying profession, we started looking into that. And it made sense to us as feminists to obviously support non-interventional, safe birth, because there's a lot of things that modern medicine, allopathic medicine, has done to improve our health, but also, especially in obstetrics, there's a lot of things we've been doing for the last 80 years that, the data shows us has harmed how our children are birthed. So everything has been really, learning on the job, so to speak, and being open to what we all need. And it's not just quote for poor people. All of us need the most efficient way of being able to run our lives because we all feel pressured for time. And so what's ever easier makes for a better quality of care and a better standard of life. It's hard to sell. People are like, oh, you should only do one thing.
Oh, tell me about that. Because I've always had the same problem. I am this kind of person who is interested in different topics. And I've always had the same issue, whether I was writing a blog or doing this podcast. I like to speak to diverse people. And, marketing people tell me, you know what, Veronica, you should just focus on one thing because that way you can target your audience better. But that way I will not be doing the things I like, Okay, I might not be as efficient, but at least I'm doing what I like. So I suppose that's the same with you and your work.
Well, efficient. What does efficient mean? Is efficient like making more money in a shorter amount of time?
No, having more listeners, like having more listeners.
I get it, but that's not the only definition of efficiency.
Or success.
Or exactly. That was the second, that was the dangling clause. I think that the whole point of all of this is it should not be a luxury to find out who you are, what you thrive on, and to contribute that to your own well-being and society's overall well-being. But yeah, I think very often it is more difficult to sell because we seem to have shorter and shorter attention spans. And it doesn't work well necessarily for sound bites and all of that kind of stuff. But, who cares? You got to just continue to, I think, pursue what you think is most important for you.
And that's what you've been doing, and you've been successful. You've helped so many people.
Well, I don't really know what success means. Years ago, there was a student intern here who was an American who is a lesbian woman who had gotten into medical school, but she didn't know if she wanted to go to medical school because precisely she was worried about her gender orientation helping her or not helping her be a successful physician. But the reason I'm talking about her is because she said to me once, one of the best ways of measuring your success is the number and size of your enemies. And I said, oh, goodness, I guess I am very successful. I never really thought of it that way.
You do have enemies?
Oh, of course. A ton, from all sorts of worlds and shapes and sizes. I think that if you have conviction and in general, your opinions and ways of being are still a minority position, of course you're going to have enemies. It's part of the gig. You can't, it's not like I go out looking for enemies. And in some ways, I might have gotten softer and more tactful with age. But also, I think the opposite happens. And you have to be careful about that because you don't want to be, even more belligerent and have that in any way negatively affect what you want to accomplish. But I think the idea that everybody's going to like you or be in agreement with you, at least that hasn't been the case in my life.
Yes, I totally feel you. And, when I'm thinking of what I like, the causes that I support, feminism and conservation, then you're going to have a lot of enemies because basically you're fighting against so many people and the whole system that it's just, I'm doing very unpopular things. But for me, they are important for the long term, survival of people and of the planet. So that's why I pursue that. You said that you understand the interconnection and you like to connect the dots. And I noticed that in your courses, I've read that CASA's peer health counselors promote reproductive health, nutrition, and environmental well being in 15 rural communities. What link do you see between family planning and safeguarding a healthy environment?
Well, I think that the main obvious connection is parity, not treating whether it's your environment or your partner or your friend or your teacher, whomever. We have to learn how to diminish our fears, because I think when we're fearful, and a lot of times that fear is based on scarcity, then we have a lack of respect and we're not capable of appropriately and frugally using our environment and being respectful of our environment. We want more and more and more. The consumerism that is worldwide now, I think, is just based on not only fear, but greed. But in part, greed, I think, is also even based on fear of, not being the best and the brightest or having the most money. And it's not even like they need more money, but what it signifies, which is that, you're supposedly a complete, successful human being. We all feel social pressures. We act like it's only adolescents who are, silly and crazy and follow, the bad leaders. I mean, 99% of the adult world, we do that too.
And what social pressures do you feel?
Um, I mean, while I have loved my work and while I have had a lot of advantages from intergenerational wealth, I still feel sometimes as an adult that because I wasn't really that successful financially as an individual, because as you mentioned, a lot of times when you work in social service or in the arts or whatever, you don't make that much money. And, sometimes I feel like I'm a failure because of that. I sometimes feel still conflicts while I just have always loved children and wanted desperately to be a mother and so much enjoyed being a mother and enjoyed being a grandma. Sometimes I feel that maybe I wasn't a great mother because of spending so much time working. Although I say to myself, and I think it's true, I always put my children in first place. I mean, again, the whole point is I know for a fact I'm not the only one with these conflicts. There are also, a lot of the conflicts I'm talking about are luxurious conflicts because I never did really and still don't have to live my economic existence from paycheck to paycheck. Again, I think that the more that we work towards feeling a sense of responsibility to everyone in our community, both locally as well as globally, the better off we will be able to become.
And Nadine, I know that this is a big jump from what we were talking about, but I'm really interested in your current life now. What are your goals now that you've retired?
Honestly, I'm doing a lot of similar work. I always feel very strongly about the importance of structural changes and that nonprofits' role is we have the opportunity often that government doesn't have to try kind of political, volatile things, but then we have to show that they work. And then it's government's job to scale up on a national scale these different programs that work. So I'm still very involved with accompanying people to continue to promote sexual and reproductive health rights. I really think that in Mexico, there's a quite extensive daycare system in the public sphere. And I would love for those daycare centers to all have libraries on site and have book lending programs. The public library system in Mexico is pretty poor. There's a million different things that I'm interested in and some shape or form trying to assist in a very humble way.
It's great that you're staying active and constantly working on things. I don't think you could do it differently, right? With the type of personality that you have, you can't stop working.
Probably not. But, I'm also enjoying my grandchildren and having more time to read a few more books myself and things like that. And I realize that I'm just a very privileged person. I wish more and more people had many of the things that I have.
And that's why you're working on it.
Uh-huh.
Thank you so much for an incredibly interesting interview, Nadine, and for the work that you're doing.
I want to learn, amongst other things, how to do podcasts. So I might be bothering you later on.
Of course.
This is just the beginning.
Yes.
Of our friendship as colleagues. I thank you too. I really appreciate it. And good luck with you and your family too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this conversation. I hope that it left you with a feeling that no matter how challenging the environment where we live can be, it's worth trying to change it for the better. We can all be solutionaries. If you enjoyed this episode, why not listen to the next one? The easiest way is to subscribe to my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or get a monthly newsletter by subscribing to it on my website, veronicaperkova.com. If you have one spare minute, please consider sharing this podcast with your closest friends. I really appreciate your help. I'm Veronica Perkova, and I look forward to talking to you soon.